Okay, Chapter 6, The Scavengers. Nick remembered everything about his life in perfect detail. How he looked, how his parents looked, what he had for lunch before the miserable accident that had landed him here. It troubled him, though, that Leif had become such a blank slate over the years he had been in his forest. If memories aged badly, fading like an old newspaper, how long until Nick suffered the same loss? He didn't want to forget anything. Having been used to travel at 65 miles per hour, Nick's southbound trek with Allie was a slow one. Hiking was not one of Nick's favorite activities. In life, it would make his joints ache, and he would invariably stumble on some rude protrusion of nature and skin a knee. This hike after death was no more pleasant. True, the bruises and body aches were gone, but he could not deny how thirsty it made him. Thirsty and hungry. Leif had told them that they no longer needed to eat or drink any more than they needed to breathe, but it still didn't stop the craving. You get used to it, Leif had told them back in the forest. Nick wasn't sure he ever wanted to get used to an eternity of longing. They also discovered their spectral bodies didn't actually require sleep. But, as with food, it didn't change the craving for it. Nick and Allie had agreed that they would take time to sleep, as they would have if they were still alive. It was a connection to the world of the living that they did not want to lose. The simple act of resting, however, couldn't be done just anywhere. "How can we sleep if we sink?" Nick had asked on the first evening. The road shoes they wore did their job well, while Nick and Allie walked, keeping them mostly on the surface of the road. But if they stood still for too long, the ground began to slowly swallow. They couldn't find a way to keep from sinking that first night, and so they kept walking. It was on the second day of their journey that the solution came. When the mountain road became treacherous, they began to find odd little patches of asphalt that weren't like the rest of the road. They were solid. The patches were never more than a few feet wide. It was Allie who figured it out when they came across one that was marked with a small white wooden cross. "I know what this is," Allie said. "I saw them when we visited Mexico. They put little crosses by the side of the road where people died in car accidents. I never thought to look for it here in the States, but I'll bet there are people who do it here too." So the passing of a spirit must leave a permanent mark on the spot where it happened, turning it into a dead spot. Nick had to admit it was an exciting, if somewhat morbid, discovery. They rested on one of the so-called dead spots, close together because the spot was so small, and as they basked in the light of their own glows, they allowed themselves the luxury of small talk. They discovered all those subjects that didn't matter much in the larger scheme of things, like what music they liked and who they thought won the World Series during their 9-month transition. Their conversation took a sober turn, as late-night conversations often do. "When I get home," Allie said, "I'm going to find a way to make them all see me." "But what if they never see you?" Nick said. "What if they just keep on living their lives like you're not even there?" "That's not going to happen." "Why not?" said Nick. "Because you say so? That's not how the world works." "How do you know? You don't know how this world works any more than I do." "Exactly. That's why I say we learn more about it before we go home. We've got to find other ghosts with more experience." "Other afterlights," Allie corrected, still refusing to admit she was a ghost. The thought made Nick look at his hands and arms, studying his own peculiar incandescence, his gentle afterlight glow. The lines that ran across his palms were still there. He could see his fingerprints, but perhaps that was just because fingerprints are what he expected to see. He wondered if he would still look the same if he had made it all the way to the light at the end of the tunnel, or if the memory of flesh would completely dissolve into the glow once he reached his final destination, a destination where his family might already be. "We have to accept that there might be nobody to go home to," Nick reminded Allie. Allie pursed her lips. "Maybe for you, but it was just my dad and me in our car. Mom stayed home because my sister was sick." "Doesn't it even bother you that your dad might not have made it?" "He made it somewhere," Allie said, "which is more than I can say for us. It's like Leif said, everyone else in the accident either survived or they got where they were going, which means that either way, they're sort of okay." Allie did have a point. It was some comfort to know that there truly was some place they were all ultimately going, that the end wasn't the end. Even so, the thought of his whole family making the mysterious journey all at the same terrible time. Then something occurred to Nick. I didn't see any dead spots where the accidents happened. We got thrown into the forest, but there were no dead spots on the road. We weren't looking for dead spots then, Allie pointed out. But Nick chose to believe that there were none. It was better than the alternative. Where were you going that day? Nick asked. Allie took her time before she answered him. I can't remember. Isn't that funny? I'm starting to forget things too, Nick admitted. I don't want to forget their faces. You won't, she said. And although there was no evidence to back it up, Nick chose to believe that too. By the third day, they had passed out of the mountains, and the highway became wider and straighter. They were still in upstate New York, many miles away from their respective destinations. At this rate, it would take weeks, maybe months, to get there. They passed town after town and soon learned how to easily identify dead spots. They were different from the living places. First of all, there was a clarity to them. They were in sharper focus, and the colors were far more vibrant. Secondly, when you stood on one of those spots, there was a certain sense of well-being, a sense of belonging, as if the ghost places were the true living places, and not the other way around. It was that fundamental grayness of the living world that stuck more deeply than any chill. Although they wouldn't speak it aloud, it made both Nick and Allie long for the lush and comfortable beauty of Leif's forest. At dusk on the 5th day, they found a nice patch of solid ground beneath a big sign that said, Welcome to Rockland County. Leaves poked through the pavement, lush and green to their eyes, eternally unaffected by the changing of seasons. The spot was large enough for both of them to stretch out and sleep. I'm tired of sleeping every night, Nick said. We don't need it. We don't get tired. And then he said the real reason why he didn't want to sleep. I don't like not dreaming. Allie felt the same way, but didn't want to say anything about it. Once, many years ago, her appendix had burst, and she had gone under general anesthesia. It was a strange sensation. She started to breathe in the anesthetic, and boom, she was out. Then suddenly she was awake again, and it was all over. There was just a hiccup of time, some groggy confusion, and she was back, with an ache in her side and some stitches. It was like not existing. Sleep here was the same way. We sleep because we can, she told Nick, because it reminds us of what it's like to be alive. How can 8 hours of death remind us being alive? Allie had no answer for him, only that it felt right, it felt natural, and in their unnatural state, anything that felt natural was a good thing. In the end, Nick stopped his grumbling and lay down. I'll lie here, but I'm not going to sleep. I'll stay awake and watch the stars. The stars, however, were not sufficiently exciting to keep him awake. In fact, they were sedating. He fell asleep before Allie did, leaving her to ponder their predicament. What if she got home and her parents weren't there? What if her father had died in the accident and her mother had moved away? She wouldn't be able to ask anyone about it. She'd have no way of finding out. She was thankful when the anesthetic sleep of Everlost finally overtook her. The ambush came without warning in the middle of the night. Nick and Allie opened their eyes to 4 stern, glowing faces looking down on them. In an instant they were grabbed and hauled to their feet, roughed up and manhandled. Allie tried to scream, but a large hand covered her mouth, a hand like that of a monster. Only these weren't monsters. These were boys no older than she. Nick, she called. But Nick was too busy fighting off 2 boys who were struggling to hold him as well. What's your problem? Nick shouted. Who are you? What do you want? We ask the questions, said the boy who was apparently in charge. He was smaller than the rest, but clearly the toughest of the lot. He wore baggy knickerbockers, not much different from Leif's, and from his lip dangled a cigarette that never got smaller and never went out. But by far the strangest thing about him was his hands. They were the size of man hands, big and knobby, and when he curled them into fists they seemed as large as boxing gloves. I think they're green souls, Johnny-O, said one kid with a weird mop of candy apple red hair that made him look like a Raggedy Ann doll. A week old, maybe less. I can see that, Johnny-O said. I'm not stupid. I know a green soul when I see one. We're afterlights, Nick shouted, just like you, so leave us alone. Johnny-O laughed. Of course you're afterlights, idiot. What were we saying is that you're new arrivals, green souls, get it? They might still got stuff, said Raggedy Andy. Green souls always got stuff. Welcome to Everlost, Johnny-O said in a voice that wasn't welcoming at all. This here's my territory, and you gots to pay me for passage. Allie gave the boy holding her a punch in the face to get him to let go. Is this how you always greet visitors? Allie said. Johnny-O took a suck on his cig. Visitors ain't always friendly. Nick shrugged off the two boys who were holding him. We don't have anything to pay you with. Yeah, so I guess you'll just have to kill us, Allie said snidely, and added, Oh, sorry, I guess you can't. Turn their pockets, Johnny-O ordered, and his goons reached into Nick and Allie's pants pockets and turned them inside out. Mostly they got lint, but Nick had a couple of things he had forgotten were in there. There was that old coin, which must have been a nickel, although the face had worn off. The tough kids weren't interested in it, flicked it back at him. He caught it and returned to his pocket. It was the other objects in Nick's pocket that got their attention. Look at this, said a funny-looking kid with dark purple lips, like he had died while sucking on a grape jawbreaker. He held up a hard little object that had fallen out of Nick's pocket, which Nick quickly recognized as a piece of what is commonly referred to as ABC gum. Gum wrapped up in its original wrapper. His mother always complained that he left his chewed gum in his pockets, and it got all over the clothes in the wash. The purple-mouthed kid held the hard, cold wad of gum and looked over at Johnny-O, hesitating. Hand it over, said Johnny-O. His voice was commanding for a boy of his size. He opened up his huge, beefy hand. Still, Purple Puss hesitated. We can cut it into pieces, he suggested. I said hand it over. Johnny-O held his upturned palm right before the boy. You didn't say no to a palm that big. Purple Puss gingerly put the small, round wad into Johnny-O's hand. Next time I have to ask you twice, Johnny-O said. You're going down. Purple Puss's Adam's apple bobbed nervously, like a walnut in his throat, or a jawbreaker. Then Allie and Nick watched in utter disbelief as Johnny-O peeled the paper from the sticky piece of gum and popped it into his mouth. Ugh, gross, said Nick. In response, Raggedy Andy punched him in the stomach. Nick doubled over out of reflex, only realizing a second later that it didn't hurt. How annoying it must be for bullies, he thought, to not be able to inflict pain. This place must be a bully's version of hell. Johnny-O worked the gum until it was soft again. He closed his eyes for a moment as he chewed. A lot of flavor still left in this one, he said. Cinnamon. Then he looked at Nick. You always waste your gum like that, he said. I mean, when you were living? Nick only shrugged. I chew until I can't taste it anymore. Johnny-O just kept on chewing. You ain't got no taste buds. Can I have it next, said Purple Puss. Don't be gross, Johnny-O said. Allie laughed at that, and Johnny-O threw her a sharp gaze, followed by a second gaze that was more calculated. You're not the prettiest thing, are you? He said. Her lips pulled tightly together in anger, and she knew that made her less attractive, which only made her angrier. I'm pretty enough, she said. I'm pretty in my own way. Which was true. No one had ever called Allie a ravishing beauty, but she knew very well that she wasn't unattractive, either. What made her madder still was that she had to justify herself, and the way she looked to this big-handed creep who chewed other people's used gum. On a scale of 1 to 10, Allie said, I suppose I'm a 7, but you, on the other hand, I estimate you to be about a 3. She could tell that it stung, mainly because it was true. 7's not worth looking at, he said, and the way I see it, we're not going to have to look at each other much longer, are we? What's that supposed to mean, said Nick, who did not like the sound of it any more than Allie did. Johnny-O crossed his arms, making his oversized hands seem even larger compared to his small chest. A single piece of gum don't buy you passage over my territory, he said. He turned to Nick. Which means you got to be my servant now. We'll do no such thing, said Allie. I wasn't talking to you. We don't need the likes of you around here. "Well," said Allie, "I'm not going without him." And the others laughed. "Oh," said Raggedy Andy, "I don't think he'll want to go where you're going." Allie didn't quite know what that meant, but even so she started to panic. "Grab her," Johnny O ordered his comrades. Allie knew she had to think of something quick, and so she said the first thing that came to mind. "Stay away from me or I'll call the McGill." That stopped them dead in their tracks. "What are you talking about?" said Johnny O, not as sure of himself as he was a second ago. "You heard me," Allie yelled. "The McGill and I have a special arrangement. It comes when I call it, and I feed it bad little thieves whose hands are bigger than their brains." "She's lying," said another kid who hadn't spoken until now, probably because he had such a nasty, squeaky voice. Johnny O looked all irritated. "Of course she's lying." He looked at Allie and then back at the quiet kid. "So how do you know she's lying?" "She's a green soul, probably just crossed over," the squeaky kid said, "which means she hasn't even seen the McGill." "Besides," said Purple Puss, "no one sees the McGill and live." "Except for her," said Nick, figuring out his own angle on the situation. "That's why I stay with her. As long as I'm with her, the McGill protects me too." "So, what's it look like?" Johnny O said, looking closely at Allie, trying to read the bluff in her face. "Well, I could tell you," she said, using one of her father's favorite lines. "But then I'd have to kill you." The others laughed at that, and so Johnny O curled his heavy hand into a fist and smashed the closest kid for laughing. He flew back about 5 feet. Then Johnny O got closer to Allie again. "I think you're lying," he said. "Guess you'll just have to find out," Allie taunted back. "Touch me and I call the McGill." Johnny O hesitated. He looked at Allie, looked at Nick, then looked at the boys around him. His authority had been challenged, and Allie realized too late that she should have figured another bluff. One that would allow this little creep to keep his dignity, because a kid like this would rather risk getting eaten by a monster than being disrespected by a girl. He looked her square in the eye and said, "You're going down." With that he snapped his fingers, a dry brittle sound, like a cracking plate. Then 3 kids grabbed her, pulled her off the dead spot, put her down on the living roadway, and began to lean heavily on her shoulders. In an instant she had sunk into the asphalt up to her knees, and an instant later up to her waist. "No!" she screamed. "McGill! McGill!" she called. It only gave them a brief moment's pause, and when the beast did not materialize out of thin air, they kept on pushing. Now it was easier for them, with Allie in up to her waist. Nick struggled and kicked against the hands holding him, but it was no use. All he could do was watch as the others leaned and pressed on Allie's shoulders, pushing her deeper and deeper into the ground. Soon her shoulders disappeared, and she was up to her neck, and still she was screaming. Hysterically now, and Johnny O just laughed. "Let me do the honors," he said, and with that he came over, grabbed her on the top of the head, and began to push down. "Enjoy the trip," he said. "Don't bother riding." And then another voice entered the fray. A high-pitched scream came out of nowhere, and a figure burst onto the scene, arms flailing wildly. "The McGill!" shouted one of the other boys. "The McGill!" Again that squealing war cry, and then Allie heard no more of it, for her ears and her eyes and the top of her head had sunk into the asphalt. Johnny O had stopped pushing, but gravity was doing the rest. The earth had her like a quicksand, and she was going down. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was completely muffled by the earth filling it. The earth had swallowed her, and the feeling of it in her chest, in that place where her lungs should have been, was more awful than anything she could remember, and it dawned on her that this could very well be her eternity. She was on her way to the center of the earth. How deep was she beneath the surface of the road now? 6 inches, 6 feet? She forced her arms to move, using every ounce of strength she had. It was like swimming in molasses. She forced one hand up high and tried to haul herself upward, but it did no good. Then, just before all hope left her, someone reached down out of nowhere, grabbed her hand and pulled. She felt herself sliding upward, inch by inch. She forced her other hand up through the asphalt until her fingertips brushed the cool air, and someone grasped onto that hand as well. She moved up, and could feel the top of her head and her eyes and her ears clearing, and finally her mouth. And she realized the screams that had been held back by the dirt and the rocks like a gag in her mouth. Had Johnny-O and his gang changed their minds, or was the monster that she had summoned out of the woods, pulling her out of the earth only to devour her? But with her eyes clear, she could now see into the face of her savior. "Leif?" she asked. "Are you okay?" Leif said. "I thought you were lost for sure." Nick was there too, and together the both of them pulled until Allie came out and landed on the solid ground by the dead spot. She collapsed in a heap, breathing heavily, and Leif looked at her strangely. I know, said Allie. "I don't have to be out of breath, but I want to be. It feels right to be." "It's okay," said Leif. "Maybe someday you can teach me to feel that way again." "Where's Johnny-O and his cast of morons?" asked Allie. "Gone," Nick told her. "They were so freaked when Leif came charging out at them, they took off." Leif laughed. "They really thought I was the McGill. Ain't that a hoot and a half?" Leif began to pull ghost weeds from beneath the Welcome to Rockland County sign and used their stalk to repair his road shoes, which must have broken when he charged Johnny-O. "Have you been following us all this time?" Allie asked. Leif shrugged. "Well, yeah, I had to make sure you didn't get eaten by no monsters, didn't I?" "Great," said Nick. "We've got our own guardian angel." "If I were an angel, I wouldn't be here, would I?" Allie smiled. After all these years, Leif had left his forest for them. It could not have been a choice he made lightly, and so she vowed to herself that from this moment on she would look out for him in any way she could. They didn't wait until dawn, figuring Johnny-O and his gang might come back. Rather than being troubled by the encounter, Allie found herself heartened by it. Nick was his usual gloom and doom, talking about Lord of the Flies and the dangers of rogue bands of parentless kids. But even in his worry, there was a new energy, because running into Johnny-O proved that there was lots of afterlights around. Not all of them would be as unpleasant as Johnny-O's gang. They came to the Hudson River and stayed on the highway that ran along the sheer cliffs, carved by the relentless glaciers of the last ice age, which lined the western shores of the river. Traffic became denser, but they bore it no mind, not caring if the occasional car passed through them. In fact, for a while they tried to make a game of it, trying to figure out what song was playing on the radio during their brief instant inside each car. "The things we dead folks do to amuse ourselves," Allie said, heaving a heavy sigh. The game didn't last long, mainly because Leif, who had never heard a car radio, much less rock and roll, felt increasingly left out. By sunset of the next day, the cheese grater gridwork of the Georgia-Washington Bridge appeared downriver, heralding their arrival in New York City. Leif was overwhelmed by the sight of the great city looming before him. It was a clear day, and the whole skyline could be seen from across the river. Leif had been to New York before, twice, once for the 4th of July and once for Mr. P.T. Barnum's circus. There were tall buildings, to be sure, but none like these. Nick and Allie stared as well. Leif assumed they were also in awe of the spectacular view. In truth, they were awed, but for an entirely different reason. "I think I know where we should go," Nick said, a strange hollowness to his voice. Allie didn't answer. "Manhattan is out of our way," Allie finally said. "We should stay on this side of the river and keep heading south." Nick looked to the city again. "I don't care what you say. I'm taking a detour." This time Allie didn't argue. Night had fallen by the time they reached the Manhattan side of the bridge. It took the whole night without rest to make it to the heart of the city. The towers of Midtown Manhattan would have taken Leif's breath away, if he indeed had breath to be stolen. But the most wondrous sights of all were the 2 silver towers he saw glittering in the light of dawn as they neared the southern tip of the city. The 2 towers were identical monoliths, steel and glass twins reflecting a silvery light of daybreak. "I never knew buildings like that existed," Leif said. Allie sighed. "They don't exist," she said. "At least, not anymore." Leif could tell the sadness in her voice went straight down to the center of the earth. The end of that chapter. Now we are on part 2, Mary Queen of Snots.